This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to another Conversation With. I'm Tom Prestigiacomo, but the conversation is with Joshua Hood. Josh is born and bred in Memphis, Tennessee, and has written the perfect summer reading for guys who want to learn more about what we do in the Army and how we do it. Joshua, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start. You grew up in Memphis and you went to school where?
I went to school at ECS from K to 12.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a long time with the same people.
And what year did you graduate from ECS?
1998.
Okay. And from 1998, when did you go into the military?
I joined the military in 2004, March of 2004.
And where did you go while you were there?
I went to Fort Bragg and Fort Benning, and then I got to go to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay. And that's 82nd Airborne. What was your rank?
I got out as a sergeant.
Okay. What do I want to ask you? What did you do while you were there and when you were overseas?
We mostly did a lot of combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we had a particular role. We were the tactical theater force for the entire country. So anytime someone needed help or money or something like that, they would call us and we'd show up and deal with whatever situation they were having a problem with at the time. So.
Did you have a specialty for yourself?
I was in the infantry. I was what was called an 11 Charlie, which is a mortarman.
Talk a little bit about the 82nd Airborne. Its history goes all the way back to Alvin York, but that was an infantry division then. But in the Second World War, it became a parachute regiment. Right.
At the beginning of the Second World War, the planners were looking at what Germany was doing with their airborne. The concept was called vertical envelopment, and back then, we didn't have helicopters, and the airplane was kind of new, and Germany was kind of on this, on the edge of a lot of very advanced things. So the American thinkers started looking at what was going on, and to put that into perspective, at the time, they thought it was impossible for an airplane to sink a battleship. We were coming from that concept out of World War I, where they had used a lot of Civil War tactics, into this new modern era.
A machine war.
Right, exactly. And it had to be faster, and it had to be lighter, and so the airborne infantry kind of came out of that. And the first ones were the 82nd and the 101st, and they went into Georgia, where the home of the airborne still is at Fort Benning, Georgia, and they basically figured it out. They had a group of guys that just figured out how to jump out of an airplane and not die.
And carry about 100 pounds of equipment.
Yeah.
We were looking at pictures of older paratroopers, and what they carried then was about 100 pounds. How much was your package?
About the same, because even though things have gotten a little more advanced, they don't seem to have gotten that much lighter. A lot of back in World War II, a lot of things were made out of wood and metal, and they were stamped, and so you had a lot heavier things. Well, now we have lighter weaponry, but we have more of it. You have different optics and radios and all these things that they didn't have then. So you have to pack a lot more of, seems like everything.
All right. So how long were you in?
5 years.
How many jumps did you get during the time that you were there?
I don't remember the exact number, but I know it was around in the 50s.
That's hard on your knees, isn't it?
And your back.
And so when you got out, what did you decide to do?
When I got out, back in 2008, coming out of the military where everything's given to you, I shouldn't say it that way, but you have, you're going to have food, you have a place to live, you're going to get paid every day. And then you come out and there's kind of this recession going on, because at the time the housing market had kind of gone down, and you don't know anything about that in the military. Especially, I just come back from Afghanistan, and so it's like I need to get a job, and then there's no job, so I immediately said, I need, something with some job security. And so living in Memphis, what's better with job security than being a police officer?
Right, that makes sense.
I applied for both MPD and Shelby County, and I was actually accepted on the same day, but I needed money, so I accepted the first one that started the school first, and that was Shelby County.
Excellent. And you've been with them now How many years?
7 years.
7 years.
Best decision of my life.
And and you work with Shelby County Sheriff's Department's SWAT team.
Yes, sir.
And what does that entail?
Well, we have a full-time SWAT team, and there aren't quite that many in the United States, but that's our primary role. And out of that, we have a lot of things that we specialize in, but we do that full-time as opposed to some teams. They're patrol guys or they do canine stuff, and then if there's a situation that arises, they get the call and they go out. We're on call 24/7, and we all have a variety of specialties and tasks that we've mastered. So it takes a while to learn those, and so the best way to utilize the money and the investment they've made is to make us a full-time team so that we can augment problems everywhere.
How big is the team? Can I ask that, or is that classified?
There's about 15 of us.
And you train together and
We do everything together. Sometimes I see them more than I see my family.
Well, there's my next question. Is the military like the police, or the police like the military? The way that you train with SWAT, is that the same way that you would train militarily?
I think the only thing different about, there's a lot of things, but the most significant is being in the police department, you get to go home every night. And that's really nice.
That makes perfect sense. So when did you come into writing?
Well, I'd always wanted to be a writer. I went to the University of Memphis and studied creative writing. Mm-hmm. And then I was getting pretty close to graduating, and someone told me, creative writing is a hobby, not a job. And I was like, well, it's a major. And they said, well, you probably want to major in something, that you can do. So I switched at the last minute to technical writing, and about the same time, 9/11 had happened, and I'd always been interested in the military. My dad was in the Navy, my grandfather was in the Navy, so I'd grown up with this feeling of an obligation to give back to the country. Okay. And in 2003, my brother graduated high school, and oddly enough, my younger brother enlisted in the military, and it's one of those things where the older brother kind of followed the younger brother for once.
Well, that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And so you went with the idea to take creative writing, or you went there and took some general classes and then discovered creative writing?
I went in to study creative writing. I wanted to be a writer, but at the time, my mom told me that the only way a writer ever makes money is if they write ransom notes. So, it was one of those things, like, it's almost, when I talk to other guys who want to be writers, it's like you say, I want to be an astronaut. Mm-hmm. And they're like, yeah, they're there. That's great. And when you want to grow up.
You mentioned a military guy that you served with that became a writer.
Right.
Was that inspiration for you?
It was, and that's a funny story also. Sergeant Joseph Halsworth was his name, and his book is The Devils of Eden. And when I came into the military, I'd gone to college first, but I didn't go in as an officer. I went ahead and enlisted because I wanted to go to the infantry and I wanted to go to the 82nd. So the only way to do that was enlist and get that in a contract. So I arrived, and I quickly learned that one of the things that they hate more than anything is a guy that went to college and was not an officer.
Oh.
Yeah, well, and I didn't know at the time. No one told me this, but I guess an officer has enough rank where you can't tell it to your face, but if you just show up as a new guy, they can tell you. So you when you come into the military, you go through this transition period where you don't know anybody, and you're the new guy and the lowest guy on the totem pole, and it's not very fun at the beginning. You do a lot of mopping and things like that, and there's a lot of jokes at your expense. But
so it's a hazing process.
I don't think we're allowed to use that word anymore, but I think back in the day, that's what they called it. Now it's just like a transition period, I think. It's politically correct. Okay. So my sergeant, Joseph Halsworth, found out that I'd gone to college and that I wanted to be a writer. And so he thought that was hilarious, and that became the butt of quite a few jokes. And I think it was 2013, if I'm not mistaken, I got a call from Joseph Halsworth, who we called Jody. And he said, hey, I hadn't talked to you in a while, but I want you to know that I just graduated from, I think it was Salt Lake City or something like that, with a degree in creative writing. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a joke. And I was like, that's funny, Jody. What have you been up to? And he's like, no, for real, I just did that. And I just published my first book. And I was like, no, come on. That was my dream. He made fun of me. Everybody thought it was hilarious. And so I went to Amazon and
found his book.
Right. And so I got off the phone and I said, well, that was my dream. I'm going to write a book too.
So that was it. You just said, you woke up and said, okay, I'm writing a book.
Well, I didn't wake up with that intention,
Right.
but yeah, towards the end of the day, I was like, well, if he can do it, I'm going to do it better.
And you did.
Well, I wouldn't say it's better, but yes,
well, you have 2 books published anyway. That's a good way to start.
I
that.
accomplished, my goal.
And my apologies to Jody in case he gets a chance.
He's not paying attention. He's probably asleep.
All right. So, what was your inspiration for the plot line of the books?
Well, with Clear by Fire, the first one, the actual genesis came when I was in Afghanistan, and we were in the Helmand River Valley. And I was listening to the radio, and they had different channels on the radio, and one of those channels is the air-to-ground net. So basically, you're listening to a JTAC, which is a Air Force combat controller. He talks to the airplanes, or you're listening to a forward observer who's talking to artillery or mortars or whatever. And so this JTAC was on the radio talking to an Apache. And basically, long story short, there was a couple Taliban guys in a compound hiding behind women shooting at coalition forces, and every time the helicopter would pass, they'd put down their weapons and pretend that they were having a picnic or something. And so I'm listening to this, and they're like, we can't engage because you have to see a threat, and he can't be near civilians. So basically the helicopter flew off, and we went back to this like cat and mouse game for a couple hours. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting if there was some type of soldier that could be in a situation like that next to, a Taliban or somebody like that, and the guy wouldn't even know that he was a soldier. Like, what type of intel could he bring in? I mean, how could he change the war? What would that look like? And so that's where it began. Right. And one of my favorite books is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Okay. And so as I was thinking about this book, I started to think, well, what type, that freedom, what would that do to a person? Like taking absolute freedom to do whatever you want to in a combat situation, what would that do to a person's like psyche or to their morals?
Yeah, Mason Kane is your main character through both of the books, although he's surrounded by people like his assistant Zeus or a companion. And then there's Renee Hart, who shows up in both books. Are they modeled after people that you knew in the military, or are they composites of different people?
They are, and Mason especially came from a composite of a bunch of different people. Some people that I'd read about and some people that I'd actually met or seen. And so I try to imagine like the perfect soldier, but then honestly look at him and say, like, what would the effect be if this guy had been constantly fighting since 2001? Like, what do you think he would think like? What would his knees hurt in the morning? Like, what would his favorite coffee be? So that's kind of where he developed.
It made me wonder if you develop your senses while you're over there, and that you really do know someone's behind you without turning around to look. Are your senses sharper because you're in a combat situation and always threatened?
Well, the thing about being in a combat situation is that, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that you don't have, back when I was in, we didn't have a lot of contact with the outside world. So we didn't have like cell phones or anything like that, so you didn't really know what was going on. And you didn't worry about bills. The only thing you worried about was like dying.
Right.
So when you take everything that is kind of with us on a daily basis in the normal life and you strip all that away, you're just left with trying to survive, and you kind of develop certain senses, like when something bad's about to happen, or you can tell when something's not right. And in the desert, smells that we're used to here, they stick out, like a cigarette at night, or the old stories they used to tell in basic training. Well, if you smoke a cigarette at night, you might get shot in the face. You think it's a joke until you go out into the desert of Afghanistan and there's no ambient light, and you just see this tiny little red light.
That's the beacon.
Yeah, and so all these things, superfluous things kind of go away.
How big was the group that you traveled in?
We traveled at about the platoon size element everywhere, so about 20 people, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more.
Did you lose anybody while you were over there? Can you talk about that?
I did in Iraq. I lost a couple good friends. And then in Afghanistan, my particular platoon was lucky. I knew some guys that had gotten killed, but when I got out, the next deployment, my very first soldier that I had as a sergeant was killed. And another soldier that was with us, that they had come through basic together and everything, they were both killed. And so that was a little bit difficult.
I was going to say, is that hard to go through?
It is. It's hard to remember because you remember like the good times, and then he's got a family, he's got a wife, and he's got a daughter that he's never met his daughter, and it's one of those things. I remember when I was in Iraq, Sergeant Large was one of the medics that got killed, and we were coming back from the chow hall, and I remember talking to him, and he said, well, it's my daughter's birthday, and I bought her a trombone or a trumpet, something like that. It was some
music
instrument. And I was like, well, that's awesome, Sarge. I was like, didn't know she played. Well, she doesn't, but she's going to learn. And so he got into the vehicle that I was supposed to drive in, and we left. And then about 30 minutes later, they hit an ID and everybody in the vehicle was killed. And it's weird when you just talk to somebody and then, you were supposed to be in that vehicle, but you're not. Right. And they have a family and you don't. And so that's kind of things that, kind of wakes you up and realize, hey, this is... And
you carry it with you for the rest of your life.
Right.
Would you call your book fact-based fiction?
Yes, I think especially Clear by Fire at the beginning, I wanted it to be as fact-based as possible, based on things that actually happened. People talk about, there's one scene at the very beginning where there's a massacre of civilians, and people said, well, you made that up. No, I did not make that up, but you can find that on the internet. Mm-hmm. And things that are in there, are based on fact. When I went to Warning Order, I was writing that in 2014, and ISIS was like this new kind of like flavor of the month jihadist group that had just started.
Well, it started with the Taliban.
Well, it started with Al-Qaeda, yeah.
Al-Qaeda and then the Taliban.
Right, and so everybody was talking about, well, these are some JV teams or whatever, but I haven't been over there and realizing the atmospherics in the area and a few other things. I kind of paid attention to them because it was almost like they were in this perfect type of storm. Like, it was, you have dry tinder and no rain, and you're just waiting for a spark. And so when I wrote the book, I thought to myself, what would happen if these guys remained unchecked? What could they do? And then, when the book came out in 2016, it's now a relevant topic. But back then, it was just, can I write something different instead of using the Taliban or Al-Qaeda?
So you came out ahead of the curve. If you're just joining us, my guest is Josh Hood, and he wrote not one but two books. The first one was Clear by Fire. The newest one that's out is Warning Order, and it's available in your local bookstores. And I want to make sure that you know that it is a military page turner. I mean, it is all for the guys, or any woman who would like to learn more about what the military goes through. And this is what I want to ask next, because your factual realities are in this book and written in a way of fiction. Were you surprised at the terrain and the way that Afghanistan and the way that Syria looked and all of those places that you served?
I was, we trained a lot of road marching and stuff for Afghanistan, and they told us, it's going to be mountainous, and I'd seen mountains before, but growing up around here and even in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, there's no mountains. Right. So when we were in southern Afghanistan, it looks a lot like Iraq. It's flat, but it's kind of hilly. When we went up north, we did a prolonged operation in the Tora Bora Mountains, and I'd never seen mountains like that. And so that really did surprise me, where they had told stories of you're going to get off a helicopter carrying 120 pounds, and it'll take you 2 hours to move, 200 meters. And I was like, yeah, that's whatever. You guys are old. You just can't do that. But when you get to that altitude and you have that weight, it seriously does, and it's pretty humbling.
I'm going to try to talk about your books now without giving away any of the plots. When I read Clear by Fire, I wondered how Mason Kane would ever be able to come back, and because I knew you had a second book, but in the second book, there's so much subterfuge and behind the back dealings, and do soldiers really have to worry about that?
Well, soldiers, we have something called the Joe rumor, and a Joe is just an enlisted soldiers, but you would hear all these very weird tales, and oh, so-and-so is doing this, so-and-so is doing that, And a lot of it, people are saying would ignore it, but for some reason, like that intelligence network that came from this guy in the general's office gets the general coffee and hears the general talking about this. A lot of it was true. And so you would hear things and you'd be like, that'll never happen. And it would turn out that, yes, it would happen.
Wow.
And so, I'm not saying that there was people over there trying to betray, America or anything like that, but there were agendas on the table.
But for me, in Warning Order, the second book, the one that came out this summer or this spring, it's almost like you can't trust anybody, or you don't know who you can trust.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing about Mason Cain was, you have something developing that's outside of his control. And, he's a very simple man. In my mind, he's a very simple soldier.
He's reduced to the survive or die mode, it looks like.
And that's what I, wanted to do was, how would a human being react to that?
It's almost like he had no emotion except to stay alive and to accomplish his mission.
And that's what, a lot of people say there's not a lot of character development in a book like that. And, with the action that fast, the characters suffer. And modern fiction is all character driven now. The plot kind of takes a back seat to the character. As long as the character is growing and, you get to understand this character and you like him and stuff. But the question that I wanted to pose when I wrote Warning Order is, what happens to the man who does what is necessary against evil? We have people that talk a lot about it, but, there's an often quoted Nietzsche, and it talks about, those who follow monsters or whatever must be careful they don't turn into monsters. And I thought that, the transition from going through the first book with the character Barnes and Mason trying to clear his name, you almost we've done a 180 with the second one. And Mason, who's a good guy, starts to look like the bad guy. But
that's what I thought at the end of the first book. And even if he wasn't, they were going to make sure that he was.
And the question that I wanted to ask was, is there any way you can avoid that as a human? Can you hold on to your humanity while doing things that are not easy?
Right.
Because I don't think he ever enjoyed
what he had to do.
But he had to do it,
I love the ending of the book. But let me ask you this. We've got about 4 minutes left. And you told me that you don't have any movie contracts. But if you did, who do you think should play Mason Cain? What actor do you see?
Well, when I first started coming up with Mason Cain, I actually did it halfway through the book Clear by Fire because, I was just writing a character. I didn't put a face to him. But I thought of Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Blood Diamond. Mm-hmm. And then there's a show called Strike Back, and it had a person named Sullivan Stapleton. I think he's on the show on the network called Blind Spot or whatever. I think both of those guys kind of have the outward swagger of who I imagine Mason Cain.
All right, and he has in this book he's paired with a guy named Zeus. Who explain who Zeus is and quickly tell me who you think would play him, or do you have?
I still haven't figured out who would play him. Okay. But Zeus is basically a guy who's come from Libyan intelligence before the fall of Gaddafi. And then he's basically left without a job, like so many other people in these intelligence services who ended up becoming, terrorists, radical Islam, or jihadists, I should say. They came from, a lot of intelligence apparatuses or military apparatus, and they were just left without a job. So, I guess we'll go kill Americans.
Right. All right. And Renee Hart, I've already figured Jennifer Lawrence should play that part, but who do you have in that?
I wrote Renee Hart in my mind was Gina Carano. She was a UFC star, and she actually, one of the only movies I've seen with her in it was Haywire. And even though she has black hair, I thought she did a pretty good job showing that she was a strong female who, wouldn't take any guff from any males.
Is there a third book in the works?
There is a third book in the works, and there's also a Renee book in the works. So we'll just have to see which one gets fed more, I guess.
Do you have a working title?
The title for the Mason Cain book is Countermeasures.
Countermeasures. My guest today has been Joshua Hood. He is Memphis born, Memphis bred, and he's written 2 books that you should take a look at if you want to be entertained, whether you're sitting in the shade or out on the beach. Clear by Fire was his first one that came out last year, and then this year it's the new one called Warning Order, and they're available in bookstores throughout Memphis, right? Or you can get them on Amazon, I would guess.
Yes, sir.
Has it been fun being an author?
It's been fun becoming an author, yes. It's a little tough, but it's one of those things that it's very enjoyable to do.
Thanks very much for taking time.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching A Conversation with Joshua Hood here at WKNO. We're glad that you took time to be with us.